Okay. Good morning. I have the correct slides. This is good. And I have a clicker that works. This is even better. Okay, I'm Martin Levy from Hurricane Electric, and the last time I was in Russia, I was talking about IPv6, and I speak a lot about IPv6, as some of you know, but today I'm going to talk about peering and a mixture of a couple of different points. At a light level, why we need internet exchange points. This may be very obvious for those people that run networks that interconnect with other networks, but it's always good to refresh this point and to see just how global this phenomenon is. But what I'm really interested in talking about is the effect of that, and talking about what it looks like when networks interconnect with each other. And literally, when I say what it looks like, I mean visually what it looks like. I'm going to talk about why this is important, and I'm going to pick one global network to talk about. And forgive me when I realize that I'm talking about our own network. And then finally, I'll just sum this up. So hopefully there's going to be some useful data, and as I said, at some point, some nice diagrams. So internet exchange points, for those people that want to sort of get back to the basics, can literally start with a discussion between 2 or 3 people. This is a diagram from the San Francisco Silicon Valley area. Milo Mendine, who was at NASA at the time, sitting and discussing what hardware needed to be put in place to let various ISPs interconnect with inside the San Francisco Bay Area. At the time, there wasn't an internet exchange on the West Coast. All the traffic was flowing across America to the Washington, D.C. area and back again. And this discussion on where to put the hardware literally was captured on a piece of paper and scanned and has been presented many times. So let's just talk about the reasoning behind why we want internet exchange points. I mean, besides the fact that they are simply a good idea, we need to get networks interconnected over and above simple transit relationships, a company buying bandwidth from another company. Equal networks like to swap traffic. And if you look at the amount of traffic that gets moved globally on the various statistic pages of internet exchanges, you will see that this is obviously a good idea from a traffic point of view, let alone the way that we want to see networks close by in certain regions. This is not a phenomenon that's going away. It's not a phenomenon that has even stayed static. It has grown enormously over the last years, both with the advent of large amounts of data coming from video or CDN sources, but simply because of the cost structure for peering becoming a lot more easier for new players to get involved in. A couple of things also. Internet peering can be at the local level, at the city level, or it can even be regional. And I'll use a map to give you an idea of that in a moment. But take a look at routing. And this was a diagram taken from the BGP source, bgp.he.net source. You saw a diagram of this earlier in another talk. The complexity of how networks interconnect is non-trivial. But in some cases you get peering, in some cases you get transit. In this diagram you see simple one-to-one relationships at the bottom, which is the peering relationships, and at the top you see this mesh of transit, of routes moving from one network to another network. I'll talk about this style of diagram later, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind. any diagram that you draw of your part of the network will change. It simply is a very dynamic structure. The other part about this diagram is that complexity is in fact actually what gives the internet robustness. A multiple path from one place to another is very valuable. I said I would talk about different styles of exchanges. Here's a map of a good hunk of exchanges. There are more. You really have got hundreds and hundreds of exchanges around the world. So for example, you will see exchanges in Europe, you'll see exchanges in North America, you'll see them in South America, and you're starting to see them show up just about everywhere. If you'd looked at a map of Africa 3 or 4 years ago, there'd be just a few points. But now you're seeing efforts in all manner of places. You're seeing even small exchanges show up in a place like Kinshasa in DRC, which has really got no infrastructure, but there is a need for keeping the traffic local. I talked about some exchanges being city-based, region-based, country-based. There's some good examples on this map. If you look at Kenya on the East African coast, you will actually, if you think about the geography of that area, you have countries around there like Rwanda and Uganda and Tanzania, which in fact can use Nairobi and Mombasa in Kenya as good gateways. So they become a regional internet exchange. And then you have places like Frankfurt and Amsterdam or Stockholm or London, which become global exchanges with networks from around the world interconnecting because of their strength and also because of one other thing. As a peering point becomes more popular, it becomes more popular. It makes it even more interesting for other players to interconnect. So that effect is multiplied again and again. But I really wanted to talk about peering and BGP and routing and show the effects of it in this region because it seemed to make more sense. So I delved into detail on some of the data, and you'll see some of the methodology and some of the results. Remember that diagram? I want to repeat it and show what is really happening. I picked a random network here in the region, and it's a nice simple network. It's depicted by the bubble on the far left-hand side. It has one transit provider, another AS number, the next one along, which in itself has 2 transit providers, and then the spider's web continues out to sort of the core of the network. It doesn't really exist anywhere, but it's where you stop diagramming. Otherwise, this diagram would continue and continue 40,000 different networks on one page. A little too complicated to diagram. But you can see in this diagram where the transits exist, and at the end you see some peering that exists one-to-one between certain big players. Well, we can take this data and we can start mapping it in an interesting manner. So the first thing that we can do is we can say, let's look at a particular country. Not complicated. The great news is that RIRs like RIPE and ARIN and AFRINIC and APNIC and LACNIC all have that data, and it's kept pretty accurate. So this is a page that just has the Russian information in there, and we can sort it by the number of interconnects. So we can look at either peering or customer count to see what one BGP network talks to another. But that's only part of it. What gets more interesting is if we start looking at where those interconnects are. So we're going to use this simple methodology and then get down to the diagrams. For every autonomous system out there, look at all the other networks it interconnects with and look at the country code. If a network is a Russian network and it only interconnects with other Russian networks, then it doesn't have an international component. But if that Russian network goes over the border, either to service a customer in another country or to buy transit from a provider in another country or to connect and peer in another country, then start flagging it as a little different. Start counting it differently. Count the number of ASs that have made it out of the country to understand where the peering and transit model is, to see if we see anything interesting. Put all the data together, build a table, see what it looks like. Well, it actually looks pretty interesting. Numbers normally aren't, you normally want them to be a little bit more visual and exciting. We'll get to that in a moment. But there's some fantastic numbers out of this region. If you look at the top number, the top line, if you look at Russia, which has got about 4,000 active ASs on the global internet, and that number is as of yesterday. I grabbed this data 24 hours ago. What we find is about 860 of those ASs have some form of connection to a network in another country. That's an amazingly high percentage. If you look at Ukraine, again, you see a fairly big number there as well, a slightly larger percentage, just to play one off the other. But if you go down this list, you'll see some alternate things going on. Turkmenistan doesn't have very many ASs, but at least 2 of them go to the outside world. And in some others, you will see a very interesting mix. I put some of the surrounding countries in here, the countries that are on the edge, and you can see some of the statistics here. In some cases, you can see a low number of connections to the outside world, maybe state-run telcos or simply a limited amount of international licensing, and yet you see maybe a large number of ASs inside the country. Wanted a more interesting way of displaying this. So we get onto the pictures. And the pictures really are more useful just to look at than try and actually build the data. But I've uploaded them onto the RIPE ENOG website. Zooming in takes a bit of doing, but it can be done. So let's look at the local network. This is not a picture of your brain. This is Russia. This is Russia as you could depict it from a network of interconnected networks. There are 4,000 different networks on this diagram. 860 of them, the ones that are colored differently in the center, are the ones that interconnect with some other country, either towards Ukraine or towards Frankfurt or towards Stockholm or towards somewhere. And those networks have obviously the ability to feed other networks. The hierarchy here may be somewhat apparent. Over on the edges of this diagram, you start seeing ASs with only 1 or 2 connections, and they're only connected internally to the country. This is a pretty impressive diagram. It actually eclipses about every other country in Europe. The UK shows up a little strangely. I didn't include the UK diagram. It does have a lot of international interconnection in it. But the reality is that this diagram is pretty impressive. The Ukraine, not as many ASs, not as many interconnected numerically, but about a quarter, according to the stats, interconnected. So you see a little bit easier to see this diagram. By the way, in the middle of this diagram is the rest of the world. Squeezed into one dot, the rest of the 48,000 active AS numbers that are out there. Now, what does this really mean? Let's take a step back and remember the subject to talk about internet peering. All of these diagrams are generated by adjacencies within inside BGP, whether they're peering or transit. Obviously, at the edge of this diagram, we're seeing lots of transit being purchased, but right in the center of it, we know there's a lot of peering going on, and that's a good thing. But good things need to be compared. Here's Kazakhstan. Not as much going on. It's a pretty big country, but they're just on less numbers. You can actually count, easily here the number of networks that connect somewhere out to the rest of the world. You can then also turn around and see that there's really a finite number of ASs there because it's visually much simpler. And it continues. Simpler and simpler. This is not uncommon in the rest of the world. If you compared all of Latin America and looked at some countries like Suriname versus Brazil, you would see this massive mix that you've seen here. But again, and I'm not picking on Turkmenistan. Well, I am. But in the corner there, you see that really with only 3 ASs, you only see one of them, sorry, 2 ASs, you only really see one of them coming out to the rest of the world. But this is more interesting and more fun. Now take all that data and turn it around and generate it geographically. Take every country and put it into a single dot and look at the interconnects between the country and see if this makes sense. And the answer is it does make sense. You absolutely see Russia providing transit and peering with networks all the way through the region. The color scheme here may be obvious, but I took the networks sort of closely in the region as one color, and those that surround it, the geographically surrounding countries, in a different color. You see that China interconnects with only a few networks. That seems to make sense. There's an exercise in politics in this diagram. You can't find Azerbaijan networks peering or transiting or BGP interconnecting with Armenia. That sort of makes sense if you read the newspapers. So all of this seems to make sense, and it also shows where the strong points are. The thickness of the line, the number of BGP sessions that can be found on the global routing tables between the collection of ASs in each country. The edge countries here actually all do interconnect, but the reality is that that wasn't the part of the diagram. I wanted just to show the insides here. And there's near universal connectivity. But this is BGP, so here's a caveat. Sometimes this is a BGP session that exists in Frankfurt, or Stockholm, or London, maybe Hong Kong, but highly unlikely. The reality is that most of the time, when you're looking at BGP tables, it's actually quite hard to know whether this is the physical interconnect or whether it goes out through a third party country at least. But this diagram, again, the data's about a day or 2 days old, seems to match how we know things operate. Okay, very quickly, because this is not the most important point, but why do we care about peering when I come from a company like Hurricane Electric? And it's a very simple statement. We run a network that exists and connects to about 60 internet peering points. It's how the network operates. It's the connectivity that we get. So promoting and convincing people to do peering is front and center, number one, within running that network. This is I think, nearly a classic sort of diagram of a global network, but as I said, we run an enormous amount of peering with many thousands of networks. So it is, in fact, actually quite important for us to keep promoting peering in all these different corners of the world. All right, I'm done, except for one last quick pointer. There is a document, if you're interested in learning more about the value of peering and internet exchanges, that the OECD published last year. It talks about, with a global review of many, many internet peering points around the world and a fairly large survey of different networks. And it talks about obvious things, that peering is good, that it has shown positive results, that in fact actually a large amount of peering is just done on an agreement in person or via email as opposed to complex contracts. And that shows that there's value for both parties. But there's a caveat. Peering is not everything. It does not remove your requirement for transit. It still is measured by networks as how much traffic can move over peering as opposed to how much is still being paid for by transit. it's a good paper and it's worth finding. The URL is on here, which is on the ENOG website. The summary is simple. Peering points have proven to be useful every single place around the world. Peering points and networks that peer have shown the benefits, absolute benefits. And if you are a network and you want to go and experiment and try this, you will find that in 99.99% of the time, peering is the right thing to do, and there's really nothing that needs to be done after that. You actually see a positive result straight away. That's my talk, and I thank you for the time. And if there's time for questions still, I'll put my headphones on. Thank you.
Пожалуйста, вопросы, докладчики.
So questions, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this magnificent introduction to the role of Russia in the global peering scene. And why do you think there's so many IS numbers in Russia? What would be your guess?
It's a big country. And that is not the only part of it. I don't have the answer, because you should have the answer more than me. However, knowing the entrepreneurs that I have met from here, there's a lot of people here who just want to go do something and do something interesting. And part of the autonomy of having an autonomous system number seems to match the mindset within this country and within this region. So I think this is partly where this comes from. But the numbers are phenomenal. I mean, the numbers I presented are the numbers of active on the routing table. I think the RIR people, the right people, can tell you the number that are registered, and I think it's far higher than that. So I think entrepreneurship has a lot to do with it. On the other hand, it's a big country.
And that's an excellent answer. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.